So, with no further ado, after setting that context, we have this guy here that we've been talking about who we really like. And he's really smart. But I can probably say a little bit more about that. He's the founder of the Climate Outreach and Information Network based in Oxford, England. And over the past 25 years, he's worked at all levels of the environmental movement, including senior positions for Greenpeace USA and the Rainforest Foundation. He's one of the leading European experts in climate change and is a lead advisor to the Welsh government and counts major environmental organizations, politicians, faith groups, businesses, and trade unions among his clients. He lives in Wales, and he's going to talk to us about Don't Even Think About It, and we look forward to learning much from him. George, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. My kind of town, Chicago. It's my kind of town. I'm really enjoying being here. I'm going to start with a story. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is stories. And I'm going to start with this story. I subscribed to this newspaper for many years. It's The Independent. It carried stories like this. This is about the destruction of the world's alpine environment by climate change. But not just that, also the destruction of the skiing industry. It told the readers, page 3 this is, so there's 3 pages already dedicated to this, that the world's ski industry maybe had another 50 years. After 50 years, the snowfall will be too low to ski on anymore. Now, this is what's interesting. This is a Saturday edition of a newspaper. It's like in America, you have Sunday editions. A very big, fat lump of wood pulp just, boom, just lands on your mat. You pick this thing up and you go, oh, that's interesting. That's the first few pages. You give it a little shake, and then out comes the travel supplement. The travel supplement containing a strange kind of what we might call cognitive dissonance. Ironically, it also has the number 50 in it. So maybe what you could do is that you could ski, you could go every year, you could go to a different ski resort, and after 50 years, with a bit of luck, you might not be on gravel. What is interesting, and this contains, I think, kind of like one of the key perplexing conundrums of climate change, is that every single one of these ski resorts can only be visited to by flying. That is to say that you are being encouraged to destroy. The first 3 pages are telling you how climate change is destroying skiing. The inner supplement is encouraging you to participate in the very activity that will destroy the thing that you love. This is, what can I say, complex, interesting, fascinating, and extremely unusual. We do not tolerate these kinds of strange cognitive moral disconnections in other aspects of our lives. That is what fascinated me when I saw this. What is also extremely interesting is that this is a kind of metaphor for what we do, that our brain separates climate change and kind of puts it into a little supplement, a little compartment of our brain, just like that Sunday newspaper, Saturday newspaper, that it sits there, and we have, as indeed the editors know very well, a very strong interest in climate change. That sits in one place. And for the readership of this newspaper, not me personally, a very strong interest in skiing. We keep these things in different compartments of our brain, just like the different parts of the newspaper. And we find this kind of like this fascinating disconnection, or things sitting next to each other all the time. This I just happened to come across this. This was a set of magazines. It was just sitting in a magazine shop. I thought, how interesting. All of these are high carbon, high polluting activities, and they're kind of just nestling around this rather grim thing in the middle. And of course, they're all speaking out to us in different ways. Now, we know for cognitive psychology, cognitive linguistics as well, we know that we have a tendency to frame things. We put things in boxes and compartments so that we can make sense of them. We can see what's what. Literally, frames. The frames are important because the frames do not just decide what we look at, they choose what we do not look at. Because, as I'm going to argue tonight, the issue of climate change is not just a matter of inattention, it's a matter of attention. There are things about climate change which make it hard for us to pay attention to. There are also things about climate change which make it rather easy for us not to pay attention to. And cognitive psychologists know very well, and in fact increasingly are arguing, that it is those processes of disattention, willingly not paying attention to things, which are actually most important for our thinking processes. It's the only way, if you think about it, it's the only way you could possibly keep sane in a place like Chicago. Indeed, it's the only way you could possibly keep sane, even in my tiny, tiny little community of Llanidloes in mid-Wales, is if you are able to not notice things because of a vast amount of visual, symbolic stimulus coming in the whole time. And that's why, as we know, most people, when they look at this pile of magazines, would very effectively blink that out. Now, they know it's there. If you said, what's the climate change issue? They'd be able to see it. But nonetheless, they can blank it out. And similarly, just as I might just as likely blank out all of the others. This reflects on climate change as well in a really interesting way. If you go out and you ask people, we could go out and do it in the street now, and you go out and ask people, say, are you concerned about climate change? Aha, you see, there it is. They'd go, yes, I'm very concerned about climate change. The majority would. We know that there's some people who are outright skeptical of it, and we know some, but there's shades in between. But the majority of people, even in the US, would say, yes, I am concerned about this. However, if we go out in the street and say, what are you concerned about? Almost no one will mention climate change, unless you prompt them to do so. In my work with my organization, I spend a lot of time doing communications design, and I sit in on focus groups. Happens time and time again, that people do not talk about climate change, even when you're prompting them to talk about concerns about the future, but as soon as you do mention it, they go, oh yeah, climate change, yes, it's terrible. So what is it? It's sitting there in that little supplement in our newspaper of our brains, just sitting on one side, and it's only there when we pick it up and we look at it. So that's one theme, but I'm going to argue that we're very, very good at paying disattention to climate change, and that's an issue. But the other thing you can tell I'm already doing is to say, it's actually, we build stories around it, and the stories we build around it both bring us close to it and take us further away. They're attracting us and repelling us at the same time, and that, I think, is the key for what is going on. But that's how we talk about it. Just as interesting is the issue of how we don't talk about it. You know, like nearly a third of people cannot recall having ever had a single conversation about climate change with anyone. That's consistent across Britain and America and Canada. So what is happening there? Because of the 2/3 of people who have had some kind of conversation, you better believe these are often very, very small conversations, and invariably with someone they already know, a member of their family. So there's no public-wide conversation about climate change at all. Now, in the course of writing the book, I spoke with people, a lot of people who are experts in various fields. I spoke with a very interesting fellow who was an expert in the construction, in socially constructed silence. Climate change has some uncomfortable and uncanny similarities to the way that people in countries suffering human rights abuses somehow manage not to notice things. In fact, in his words, we enter into contracts without talking about it. We enter into contracts about what can and cannot be publicly recognized. But we don't talk about it. And indeed, you know what? You can go out and find it. Go and do it. Just go and talk to somebody about climate change. Probably many of you do this as part of your work or your lives if you care about this. And as soon as you talk about climate change, you go out there and just dies, doesn't it? It just dies. I have a friend who tells a great story. He tried to bring this up at a dinner party, surrounded by people who were like just talking about their holidays, and they were flying off here. They were retired professionals like himself, and they were flying off, and they're going off to Australia to visit their families. He cared passionately about climate change. He couldn't take it any longer. He said, what are you talking about? How can you talk about this? How can you talk about this? He said, don't you realize what you're doing for your children's future? You're going off to Australia to visit them, and you're destroying their future. Anyway, he went off on his rant, because he's a bit like that. which is, to be honest, is why they don't let him out very often. But he got invited to his dinner party. Anyway, it goes completely quiet, he says. It goes completely quiet. No one says a thing. Then somebody says, they go, oh my word, what a lovely spinach tart. Oh, delightful. So fresh. Is it your spinach? Did you pick it yourself? It's organic, because I think organic is so much nicer, so much fresh. Where's the recipe from? And they also, so he said, they went for 10 minutes. He says, this is him speaking, 10 minutes they talked about the bloody spinach tart. Then they move on. It's like the spinach tart was there, it was the intermediary, something he had walked straight into, a socially negotiated, bounded silence of what you cannot talk about. Straight through it, bang, and out. And if you don't believe me, and if you haven't experienced this yourself, just try it. Because life's an experiment, after all. I spend a lot of time speaking to people. The best way to learn about people is to speak to them. Like this lady I'm going to tell you about now. I spent a lot of time when I was writing a book going to areas that had extreme weather events. And I went to the middle of Texas, where most of a third of a town of Bastrop had burnt down in extreme wildfires following record-breaking drought. I also went into New Jersey, to areas devastated by Hurricane Sandy. I asked them the same question I just told you. Could you tell me, please, about the last time you had a conversation about climate change? Who did you speak to? What was it about? I was really very surprised to find that in neither of these areas could anybody apparently recall a recent conversation on climate change, despite the fact that they had both been severely affected. The editor of the Bastrop Chronicle said, "Oh, well, we would cover it if it was relevant to Bastrop County." And I said, "Lady, with all respect, you know, your state climatologist is saying that there's a connection there." And this is Texas, remember, so that's kind of a brave thing to do. I said, you're very carefully, I have to say, he was very careful about it. But he was saying it, and your own house burnt down, and you know, with all respect to you, since when do newspapers require things to be 100% guaranteed before you talk about them? I mean, if there's an evidence and there's a basis for talking about it, is it not worthwhile talking about it? Because down the road, I just spoke to somebody who told me that he thought that it was a terrorist attack. So there's plenty of theories out there. She said, "Oh, no, we only really cover local issues." Well, she didn't speak quite like that, but I can't do a Texan accent. So, and this lady here, dying along, she's wonderful. There she is, waving the sign, do. Do is the first two letters of Donovan's. Donovan's was a bar down in Seabright, down by the beach. It got destroyed. And so she took the first two letters of its name, do, the first two letters of Donovan, which was all that was left of it after Hurricane Sandy went through. And there she is. It's like a talisman that Dinah hangs up. Do rebuild, do come back, do reinvest. And it's all of the narratives are very positive, rebuilding the community, strength, resilience, all of that. Great. I very much admire it. So I said, "Dinah, why aren't you talking about climate change?" She said, "Are you crazy? I'm not going to start talking about climate change. I'm trying to get people to reinvest in the area, to rebuild." I said, "Okay, how about this? How about you and your other mayors, you all go off to the Senate and you set up a press conference and you say, 'We're on the front line of climate change. We demand action now.'" She just laughed. She said, "Are you crazy?" She said, "I'm not going to do that." She said, quote, "Duh." She said, "Climate change, sure, it's happening, but we're going to leave that lofty stuff to another day." And I totally understand where she's coming from. She's doing a great job for her community. But you know what? If the people who are extremely affected by climate change can't talk about it, and the people who aren't affected by climate change, quite frankly, they've got other things to do with their life, and all the people in between are so busy with their spinach tarts that they can't even engage in a dinner conversation, what's left? Climate change perpetually stranded in this territory of the disattention, what cannot be talked about. I was trying to think about this. This is like a blind spot, but sometimes people say it is. And when I had a better idea, I was just coming back from New Jersey. I was on the taxi. This was a couple of days later. I was kind of thinking about this. And you know how, like, taxi drivers, they have this thing where they say they want to talk about celebrities they'd had in their taxi. Anyway, so my taxi driver, he'd had Donald Trump in his taxi. Okay. You've heard of Donald Trump, right? I notice he has a certain, you know, modest contribution to this city. And all he wants to talk about is Donald Trump's hair. I won't use his exact words, but he says, "That man has the most stupid hair I've ever seen in my life," he said. "You cannot believe it." Here's Donald Trump's hair, in case you're wondering what it looks like. Now, this is technically what we baldies call a comb-over. And I'm allowed to laugh at this as somebody who admits to my own male pattern baldness. Mr. Trump does not. And I was thinking, okay, that's very funny, and I enjoyed what he was saying. But I was also thinking seriously afterwards that maybe climate change is a bit like this. Maybe it's like something that starts as like a little problem, and then you just sweep over a little bit, and it gets a bit bigger, and you sweep over, and you grow your hair a bit longer, and you sweep over, and you sweep over. And then you reach a point where you can't stop doing it, because to stop doing it would be to admit that you were doing it in the first place. And you start combing from the back of your head and combing over, right? And you know you're doing it, but you can't stop doing it, because to stop doing it would be to admit that you're doing it. Everybody else knows you're doing it, but they're too polite to mention it. I guess in the case of climate change, they're probably all doing it as well. Do you see what I mean? It's a socially constructed way of avoiding a problem where everybody knows that you're doing it, but it's not considered socially appropriate to mention it. You know, it's silly, but it's the best analogy that I can find.